Welcome to The Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. I have with me today an author, a lecturer, someone has studied people being exonerated from their charges in prison, and I want you to join me in welcoming Alison Flowers.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, in your book, Exoneree Diaries, you looked at 4 cases of people that was exonerated. One, how did you select them, and what drove you to write a book about this anyway?
Yeah. So I decided to write this book when I was working at an Innocence project. It was a journalism-based Innocence project at Northwestern University. So I was actually on the front end of looking at wrongful conviction cases, investigating old cases, and trying to see if there was evidence that might potentially free innocent people. And then one day I realized, well, what happens when those innocent people are freed? What sort of resources are in place? What's the aftercare look like? And it turns out that there are a lot of gaps when it comes to working with exonerated prisoners as they're leaving prison. I selected the 4 because I, wanted to make sure that they were racially diverse. I thought that race is such a key part of the equation when it comes to wrongful convictions that I didn't want to ignore that very important factor. And I also selected the cases I did and the people I did because of their cases, which show the many breakdowns in the criminal justice system and the contributing factors to wrongful convictions. So in reading their stories, and they do read like stories, of course, but in reading their stories, you become aware of how exactly an eyewitness misidentification happens, how a false confession happens, or bad forensic evidence. Official misconduct is seen in most of these cases too. And those are the contributing factors to most exonerations, false accusations being the number 1, of course. And so that's why I narrowed in on these 4 cases. And also, most of them hail from Cook County, which is where Chicago is. And in Cook County, we have the highest number of exonerations in the country. So I sort of consider it the wrongful conviction capital of the country, which is why I focused on those 4 cases.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you, just from your research and your study, do those cases represent the demographics across America of other cases like that? Because one of the things that happened is that I spent 44 years in the prison system myself and got exonerated, right? But through the process, of course, I'm always paying attention to other cases where they're letting people out. You did 30 years, we were wrong, sorry, you can go. You did 15 years. And it was like a drip, drip, drip across America, throughout the nation, but it was never like a kind of like a flood. So it seemed like a small amount of people getting out, but in the prison system where I was, there was a tremendous amount of people that had innocent claims, but had to fight years. I, in fact, had to fight after that for almost 32 years. So is this something that's widespread across America?
So there are only about 1,800 exonerations that we know about, and that's due to the National Registry of Exonerations, which tries to track these as they happen, as they find out about them, all the way back to 1989. But there's really no way to know when someone has been exonerated. It's not like the court sends out an advisory or a press release or, any sort of thing like that. And so the researchers basically have to find out about these and research these exonerations themselves to add them to the registry. And there's about 1 new one every 3 days in this country, and they find out about old exonerations all the time. But to the larger question of how many innocent people are sitting in prison, you mentioned, you were aware of a lot of innocence claims going on. And I think that the number is much higher than the 2 to 5% that most people, most studies cite. But even, let's say, if it is 2 to 5%, there's 2.3 million people locked up in this country. And that's, close to or exceeding 100,000 people who are likely innocent of the crimes that sent them there. And so, that's not even touching, of course, on the larger question of mass incarceration, which I hope is one that this book addresses as well. But, there's no real way to know the number of wrongly convicted people that are languishing behind bars right now. But we do know that it's at least tens of thousands of people.
And I would dare say hundreds of thousands, as you were saying, especially if it's 2 to 5%. What kind of compensation do they get? I mean, okay, you snatch somebody up, you cause them to lose their livelihood, most likely. You put them in prison. You put them in debt for lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. You disrupt the family, and then you discover that it was a wrongful conviction. What, if anything, is the states doing to compensate people and take care of them?
Well, the states are not compensating uniformly, and they're not compensating enough. So when you leave prison as an exoneree, regardless of who you are or where you are, there are no immediate resources for you. You leave prison without a dime in your pocket. You don't even have a bus pass. If you're wearing the shoes that belong to the prison, you might get charged for those, right? And so your family has moved on, your spouse probably divorced you, your kids may not know who you are anymore, and your record is not automatically expunged, so it's very hard to find work and move on with your life. If you do happen to live in a state where you were wrongly convicted that does compensate, there are 30 states and DC do compensate exonerees, but many of those laws fall short. In Illinois, where I am from, the most you can get, regardless of how long you spent behind bars, is $200,000. In most of those states that do allow for some compensation, you actually have to petition a court for your innocence and for that compensation and prove your innocence all over again, which is actually a different standard of proof than it took to originally convict you, when all you had to do then was prove that you weren't guilty, right? And now all of a sudden you have to prove your innocence to the court in order to get any measure of compensation. And that's a very hard legal process to undertake, especially as someone who's just trying to make your way in the world. And, you'd be a better expert on that than I would, but that is what I hear many exonerees report. So the lack of aftercare is a very serious thing. I think what we need is some sort of annuity or uniform system state to state, where exonerees, for every year that they were wrongly convicted and serving time behind bars, received an amount for every year, and probably an amount for the rest of their lives. I think that is the appropriate way to deal with it. Other states just sort of leave a question mark. They'll compensate you, but you have to kind of lobby for the amount. And what makes you think that an exoneree can necessarily mount a political campaign and can take that on when, you're just trying to get medical and social services, maybe some counseling, dental, and a job? So there's a lot that needs to be looked at.
In Maryland, say, for instance, the highest you can get compensated for is like $330,000. So you can spend 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and that's the cap. And the only way you can get a higher amount is then you have to follow all of those processes, go to the governor, get the Secretary of the State, a number of high officials to sign off on your absolute claim of innocence before you can be compensated. And most people don't even have the time, the wherewithal, like you say, or the resources to do that. What do you, and in your research, have you noticed the kind of impact exonerees have in returning to the community, and the kind of treatment the community might even see? Okay, well, you've been gone for 5 years or 10 years, they let you out. We don't want you in this neighborhood. We think you might be a pedophile, or we think you still might have done it, or this or that. What kind of reaction toward exonerees and in the community have you noticed, if any?
Well, I'd say that all the exonerees that I've talked to and the ones in my book really want to be a part of their communities, and many have succeeded in doing that, even starting their own programs and that sort of thing. But they do live behind a wall of suspicion for the rest of their lives, because there's not this clear proclamation of innocence unless you live in a state where you can acquire that, which again is very difficult to do. Then basically you're released because your conviction was vacated because the evidence no longer stood or new evidence was raised, right? But there's still sort of a gray area, I think, not in the exonerees' minds or in my mind, but in society's mind, in the community's mind. And so they do sort of experience a lot of suspicion and skepticism around the circumstances that led to their release. Like, well, did you just beat your case? Was there a legal technicality? Or maybe you didn't commit this crime, but you committed some other crime. And I think it just kind of speaks to the punitive mindset that a lot of Americans have. Even if that were true, a lot of parolees are leaving prison with intentions of rebuilding their lives. But when that's the reception that you get, along with a lack of resources, then you can very much understand why someone can fall easily into, a life of crime again. Or for some exonerees, surviving is so difficult. We had an exoneree in Illinois who is actually part of the reason why the death penalty ended in Illinois. And a few years later, he was picked up for stealing a bar of soap or something like that. And so until we really care for people leaving prison, whether you're an exoneree or a parolee, I think that, we're going to see repercussions of that, especially because of how they're treated in their communities.